All right, so this is a very simple tutorial to teach people how to do a simple Hello World um, application. This will go over a couple things. It'll go over what how to create a method, how to create a variable, and then how to call that method in order for it to execute and print something in the console. So, I mean, there's a couple things just mentioned in that brief introduction that maybe if you're new to, um, coding or programming, you're not familiar with a method, you're not familiar with a variable, um, maybe you're not familiar with the console. Um, so hopefully in this tutorial you kind of get an overview of what those things are and how they kind of all tie in together for you to start kind of messing around with code and seeing how things work at a very fundamental level. So I am currently using Visual Studio Code in order to just program and write files. I highly recommend it. It's a very, very, really useful application in order for you to begin programming. Um, all right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm gonna go ahead and create a new file, and I'm gonna create this. I'm gonna call it Hello World.js. So if you're gonna use Visual Studio Code or any other IDE, um, and you want to code in JavaScript, you have to save it with the .js extension in order for your machine to recognize that, hey, we are using JavaScript in order to run some code. So that is just a very, I guess, important detail to note, that whenever you go ahead and try to create a program, that the file extension corresponds to the language that you're writing in. So doing hello world.js. Save. Okay. All right. Let's exit that. Okay. So, um, first things first, we are going to define a variable, and a variable is basically um, a variable is basically something within your program that's going to hold a specific value, or or a specific value or something that represents um, something else. But at the moment, we're just going to use it as something that represents a specific value. So the way we define this is we say var is the keyword that you will use in order to tell the program, hey, we are defining a variable. Okay, so we're going to call it var, and then we're going to call it my message, and we're going to set that equal to something called a string when it comes to programming. So a string is basically like text, um, and and that's what we are going to set my message equal to, and we're going to say hello world, and then a semicolon. So what we did here, and this is usually what I like to do when I program, is I like to say, var is the keyword that lets the program know I am defining a variable. My message is the name of my variable that holds the string value hello world. And I guess this might be a little redundant, but it never hurts. And then my string value is hello world. So that's, personally, that's how I would break down code. So as you can see, just this little simple line of code. Um, I mean, if you try to explain it conceptually, it takes up already a lot of kind of mental capacity, like basically holding all these concepts together in your head. And what I did here is I just wrote comments. So these double slashes um, are basically just ways that you can comment within your file just to write notes. So when you run your program, it's not gonna recognize this as code. It's just what it's gonna recognize is like, oh, okay, these are just like comments that were written within the code that don't really matter because they're not doing anything. They're just comments. This is what matters here. So this is our variable. Our variable is called my message, and it is equal to a string value called hello world. And again, a string value is just plain text that you are storing within a variable. So now we are going to define something called a function. So a function is basically a instruction that is within your program that is telling your program what to do. So the keyword we use here to define our function is function. Um, and you can call your function anything you want to call it. It's basically the same idea as a variable. You could call this variable message. Uh, you can call it message. You can call it text. You know, you can call it many things. These names are arbitrary, and they are defined basically how you want to define them. The only things you can't switch up are keywords, and the keywords again are just telling your program, hey, this is what I want you to define for me, or this is what I want to create. So here we wanted to create a variable, so we did var my message. Here we want to create a function, so now we're telling the program, hey, I want a function, and I'm going to call that function, um, let's see, what's a good name here? I'm just going to call it say hello. Um, and when we define a function, we use the keyword function. We name our method whatever we feel is useful for the program or um, makes sense for the program. In this case, we're going to want a program that says hello world to the console. So I'm going to tell this function I want to call this function say hello because I feel like that is meaningful towards the program we're trying to create. So um, in this function, we are going to go ahead and call a method that will allow us to print to the console. So now we're going to say console.log, and we're going to call my message. So what I just did there is I'm telling my function, hey, I want a function, let's name it say hello, and within this function I want to print to the console, and I want to log a message that is represented by my message. So really what we're saying here is console.log allows allows us to print a message to the console. We can pass a variable to console.log so that it can print a message. therefore we get console.log my message. Yeah, so basically we have this variable, and we have this variable called my message, and we want to create a function that will use that variable to print something to the console. Um, so when I call this function is going to say, oh, okay, my duty is to print something to the console, and that something is defined by my message. So now that we have that out of the way, we can step out of the method and just call the say hello uh, method. And that's basically what you do here. Is right here you're just calling say hello method to perform its duty. And its duty is to just print my message to the console. So now let's go ahead and run this. And boom, we get hello world. So that is a very simple, fundamental, entry level, probably the simplest thing you will learn in a programming class is how to print something to the console. And this is how you do it in JavaScript. So just an overview. Um, my messages are variable. Our keyword var is letting the program know, hey, we're defining a variable called my message that holds a string called hello world. We have a function called say hello, and this function's duty or its job is to print something to the console and log a message that is represented by my message. And then once we create our function, we step out of the function and we go ahead and call the method so that it can perform what it needs to perform. And so that is a very simple way to print something to the console. We could maybe even make this simpler. I'm going to comment out this code. And we are actually, instead of using a variable, we could do something like hello mundo. And so now, when we run this, we get hello mundo. So let me do that again. Hello mundo. So what I did there was, instead of using a variable, my message, instead of using this my message variable, what we did is we basically just put a string in there instead of putting an entire variable, which is possible within JavaScript. So yeah, there's different ways of doing things in programming. That's definitely one of the beauties of programming, is just how many ways you could do something. So yeah, I mean, we could pass this variable my message, or again, we could just say hello mundo, and then boom, you know. Okay, so hope that helped some people kind of understand what variables are, strings, how to define a function, how to print to your console, and how to call your function. So actually, let me write those things down. So we did how to define a variable, how to store a string value in a variable, how to define a function, how to print something on, oh, well, I guess the proper term is log, how to log something in the console using a variable, and then fifth, how to call your function. Yeah, so those are very basic level things when it comes to JavaScript programming. So yeah, hopefully these 5 areas are cleared up for you. If not, please let me know and I will go ahead and clear them up for you. But thanks again for watching. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial and I hope you learned something.